If you're familiar with my previous videos, you may actually have already seen this sword. And this is actually one of the favorite pieces in my collection just because of the way I kind of came about owning it. So if you're interested, go check out that video if you haven't yet. And the reason why I'm showing it in this video today, again, isn't to constantly repeat myself, but is because the topic of the video, as you probably can tell from the title, is Walloon-hilted swords. And I'm sure a lot of you have already made that connection in your head when seeing this, because this sword actually carries most of the common characteristics of a Walloon-hilted sword. You'll see it has a kind of double shell guard. It has this semi-basket hilt configuration that is also the rather open and in a way simple and a bit asymmetrical. So you have these bars that just kind of seemingly randomly cover your hand, and it's overall just a beautiful type of sword. So why am I talking about Walloon-hilted swords again? The reason is I think that this also is a Walloon-hilted sword. So you'll probably see very similar characteristics, but also some differences pop out, I think, right away, instantly. So the whole point of this video, I suppose, is looking at different types of Walloon-hilted swords and looking at how varied this environment can be. And just to add to that, I'll tell you that there's another Walloon-hilted behind me here on my left, and there's another Walloon-hilted here on my right, and each of these swords is similar in many ways, but is also extremely different. So I think it's useful, or it can be useful, because lots of times when we think about sword typologies, we may have the tendency to kind of look for standards or patterns that are a little too tight and narrow compared to what historical reality actually had to offer. And the reality of historical times is that swords, or objects in general probably, have a massive amount of variation, and it's useful to kind of recognize different patterns when we're able to, and this is exactly that kind of opportunity we have. So let's dive into the close-ups. Well, I hope you enjoy the display I set up. I also have to start with a disclaimer, which is that given the limitations of the space I'm working in, it's impossible for me to actually film all of the swords in their full length so that you can see them and compare them kind of in their full view. I will take a picture of them all together, so I'll put it up on the video as I talk about the measurement and the practical qualities of them, so you can kind of compare. But other than that, we will be using this visual because, well, most of the difference are in the hilt, and this is kind of the only comparable angle I can work with. So a first thing I want to talk about here is the name. While we know these swords commonly as Walloon-hilted swords, and this, you'll find this kind of denomination in forums, in online discussions, in all kinds of modern communities. This is how these swords are often known as. The name is a little more complex though, because even in specialized literature, these are not often referred to officially as Walloon-hilted swords. So I can give one example. Jan Piet Paupe, so the Dutch author of masterpieces on Dutch or Dutch-related edged weapons, he usually refers to these as weapons called or known as Walloon-hilted swords. So this already tells us that this name wasn't a kind of official denomination, as, I don't know, it's not like a fascinemesser or something like that, but it's a colloquialism that was broadly picked up and today is used commonly. But where that was picked up, or by who, or the history of this name, is one initial point of mystery. However, I'll leave the whole history of the Walloon-hilted sword, because it's rich and complex, for another video, because, well, otherwise this one would end up being really too long. And here I want to just dive into the comparison of the characteristics of swords that would be commonly referred to as Walloon-hilted. And my goal here isn't to try and create kind of new patterns, so it's not to say, hey, these four represent Walloon-hilted typologies, but it's just to kind of bring your attention to the fact that when we talk about Walloon-hilted swords, we're not talking about a one style of sword. Just one more thing regarding the name. Perhaps there are many different names for Walloon-hilted sword, actually. Some are German, so you have like haudegen or felddegen, and these would basically kind of translate as field sword or hewing sword. And you have a bunch of other different names. There was like, I think in Germany at some point, these were called like Swedish swords or something like that. So it's really a strange kind of world where a sword that was common throughout all of Europe, and actually exceedingly common in the sense that this was probably, we're talking about the 1600s up to, let's say, the 1700s, the start perhaps of the 18th century. These were super, super common swords, and yet we don't really have a one name for them, and we don't really even have clarity about their names. So as the many names suggest, field sword, hewing sword, these are generally heavy swords meant for military use. These aren't a kind of town sword that you just carry, like they're not a fancy sidearm that you carry to look good in court, or that you carry for maybe having to defend yourself in a brawl. These are meant for heavy use in war. But that is not exactly completely true. That's what the name communicates. However, we'll see these two on this side are rather small and lighter, and these don't actually translate as well for a cavalry use on a 17th century battlefield, for instance. What we do know is that swords like these, so swords with quote-unquote Walloon-hilted swords, in a scaled-down version or in a lighter version, were actually commonly used on ships. I already talked about it in the video where I talked about the VOC, so the Dutch East India Company. And Matt Easton also talks about it in his video about what swords pirates used. So we know that there existed lighter versions of these swords, but that's often as many things go. We don't really have a lot of very practical information about these smaller scaled Walloon-hilted swords. So what is the general knowledge is that these would have been kind of cavalry swords, swords used in battlefields. However, as you'll see with these four, the differences in size and weight are actually astounding. And then after looking at these differences, we'll also dive into like specific qualitative differences, like in the hilts and in the blade profiles and these things here. I'm going to also mention that now, as we talk about the measurements of these swords, which we're going to do now, here's the picture with them compared in their full length. We'll be going from left to right, and this kind of connects from lightest or smallest in general to the heaviest and biggest of these versions of swords. So if we start by looking at the length, this one here comes in at a minuscule size, and I'll give you a moment to perhaps make a guess, just because I think it's a very interesting exercise to kind of try and check how easy it is for you to make assumptions based on just an image. So if you've thought about it, and of course you have the picture there to see how different they are, but the length on this sword here is 77.5 centimeters, more or less. These measurements are made rather roughly for this video, so I haven't yet done like the millimeter precise kind of measurements, but it's not going to be much different than 77.5. And 77.5, to be clear, is perhaps just a little longer than a briquette. It's like a little longer than your average hunting hanger. It's a really, really small sword. However, don't let that fool you, because the hilt and grip is actually quite spacious even for the modern hand. So it's obviously not a purely scaled down sword. It's not like a scaled model of a Walloon-hilted sword. It's a functional sword. Now, moving to this one, which is the VOC, so the Dutch East India Company Walloon-hilted sword. This one is a little bit longer at 92 centimeters. So hardly reaches the meter. A meter is often kind of a standard size for a full-size sword. This one is a little shorter than that. But considering that we know for sure that this is a kind of sword that would have been used on ships, or at least by troops who would have been spending a lot of time being transported on ships to the other side of the world, it's not perhaps surprising that their sword is actually kind of shorter than average. Now, if we move to the third sword you see here, this one is, we talked about average, this is exactly that. This one comes in at exactly 100 centimeters. Again, give or take a little because these measurements are rough. The last one you see here, instead, is the biggest and heaviest, and is what is normally called a Amsterdam City Guard sword. You'll find this Like auction houses or books often refer to it as this. It's debatable, by the way, whether that is actually an Amsterdam City Guard sword, but we'll talk about that another time. This one comes in at 106 centimeters. So we have a difference between the shortest and the longest of a same kind of typology of sword. The difference is of, well, about 30 centimeters. That is not a trivial difference. However, coming to weight, I'll give you again a moment. You have the picture, you have the length data, so perhaps take a couple of seconds to try and estimate what you think the weight on these swords would be, and we'll dive into them right away. Okay, so I hope you made your calculations. If you needed to, I hope you paused the video. So this one comes in at 756 grams. Considering its short size, it's perhaps a little heavier than you may initially imagine. This one, which is actually about, I would say 15 centimeters longer than this one, is surprisingly lighter. And not just a little lighter, it's about 50 grams lighter. This one comes in at 708 grams. Now, granted, this one is missing the metal wrap on its grip, so it would be more something like this. However, that would add not much weight. So it still is lighter than the smallest version, even though it comes in at an extra 15 centimeters. And the hilt, actually, as you can see, is bigger in scale. Now, if we look at this one at 100 centimeters is almost a kilo. We're talking about 968 grams. So this starts being in the range of heavyish swords. It matches more the hewing sword kind of name. This is something that has enough weight in it that it'll take off an arm on the battlefield, let's say. And moving to the last one, we have almost a kilo. This is really, really close. It's 993 grams, and perhaps the fact that it's missing one of the shell guards, if it did have that, it would reach the 1 kilo threshold. So this is hopefully useful for you just to get an idea of how varied the spectrum of Walloon-hilted swords is. But with the measurements out of the way, we'll focus a little bit on common elements of these Walloon-hilted swords, and then we'll use these common elements to also discuss how each one of these kind of diverges a little and becomes a unique sword in itself. Well, starting with the common points of Walloon-hilted swords, as I mentioned, and probably this is the best example because this is the most traditional Walloon-hilted sword hilt out of the four, I think. You'll see it has these asymmetrical shell guard, which is pierced in this case. This is a very common characteristic. And the shell guard isn't like one piece. It's two metal plates that are fixed within a frame. And this is why you often find many of these without one or both of these shell guards, because they just kind of pop off. And you'll see that this frame then continues in a knuckle bow right on the front, and then a side protection here on the outside side of the hand. And sometimes you also have one on the inside. And then you occasionally, or depending on the kind of sword, you may have these kind of bars, the kind of this connecting bar here. So you have these converging on the knuckle bow, let's say. So it's kind of, at a first glance, it kind of looks like a mess, but in reality, it's quite simple. You have a knuckle bow and a side protection on the outside of the hand, and you have often a thumb ring, which I didn't mention. And then all of these kind of tend to converge here on the knuckle bow, except for the external side protection, which goes directly to the pommel. Now, speaking of the pommel, these can be, as you can probably tell, looking at these four swords, these can be quite different when it comes to shapes. But what is normally common is that these knuckle bows and the different bars are fixed into the pommel with the use of screws. And one last characteristic is the presence of a upturned quillon. You'll see it here, you'll see it here. There's one here, I promise, but it's been bent out of shape. And so the typical characteristics of your typical, stereotypical Walloon-hilted sword would be as we mentioned, this typical guard with two bars, one on the outside of the hand, one on the knuckle guard. These bars are often connected by extra bars between them. that often converge onto the knuckle guard, onto the knuckle bow, I mean, and these bars are usually fixed onto the pommel by means of one or more screws. And then we have this asymmetrical shell guard that is usually or often pierced. And the quillon, of course. These are like the stereotypical characteristics. So now with that out of the way, let's start looking at how these different swords diverge from the standard. So the first thing we'll see is that some of these have these swellings, this one and this one exactly, whereas others are super smooth, like this one, or close to smooth, I would say. So both of these are to be expected in the sense that both of the swellings, whether they're more visible or more like swollen, as in this case, or the smooth versions, are both consistent with historical examples, of course. Another thing I wanted to draw your attention on, I just mentioned it before, is the size of the pommel and the shape of the pommel. You'll see that these are actually quite different. You'll see actually the two middle versions are perhaps the most similar. They have almost like a ovoid pommel, although this one is a little bigger and more stout rather than this one. And this one instead is extremely flat. It's almost like a fig-shaped pommel to an extent. And this one is round but flat. You can't really see it here. I'll show it to you later when I pick this. Well, actually, we're talking about it. I'll show it to you now. But you can maybe see it's not exactly a spherical pommel, but it's kind of flattened on this side here. It's kind of squashed, whereas here it's more round. So pommels can have a lot of variety to them. So, but overall they tend to be on the roundish variation on the theme of the sphere, I would say. So don't expect like really weird pommels like the Schiavona cat head or something like that. Now, coming to the grip, you'll see that, well, these two, unfortunately, we don't have the original grip anymore, but these two we do. We have, very commonly, we have a metal wire wrapped grip. Although, if I'm not mistaken, I've also seen some wrapped in leather. So I don't know if that was the leather that perhaps was underneath the wire wrap or if it was wrapped directly on wood. These are wrapped directly on wood, by the way. And talking about differences, I think these four swords are really interesting because each one of them presents like one or a few elements that are completely different from the other three. So we'll start with this one. And the first thing that's different on this one is, well, apart from its size, of course, but the thing that was kind of bothering me for a while until I actually realized it was a bit of a eureka kind of moment, is the quillon. This has a completely different configuration in reality, even though it seems similar. But this is a sword that has a traditional crossguard, like you may have on a pillow sword, or like you may have on a medieval sword, for instance. So the two symmetrical quillons here, over which was built a Walloon hilt, basically. So this I find to be a really interesting characteristic. I have to say, this has puzzled me for quite a bit, and I've even considered it perhaps being not authentic. But I have seen some examples, few to be honest, like literally a couple, but I've seen a few pictures of similar swords with this exact same style of quillons, so they do exist. So yeah, this is quite interesting for me. And whereas as we see the others, just to compare, in one way or another, all have this, the more traditional style of quillon. Another interesting difference here is, in this sword specifically, is the pommel. So I mentioned that most of them are fixed in place with screws. This one, however, has notches cut into the pommel, and then the edge, well, let me show you close up. But basically, yeah, you can see there's no screw. These are kind of wedged into these notches in the pommel, and that's how they're fixed in place. Now, never mind the old tape here. I actually might remove that, so maybe in a future video when we look at this one in more detail, we'll actually get a look at what's underneath. But this is another difference, let's say. Apart from the shape of the pommel, even the style of fixing the guard to the pommel is different. Now, moving on to the Veusé sword. So this one, its main difference, I would say, apart from it having the smooth completely smooth guard compared to the other three, which actually have some form of decoration on them. The interesting thing here is that I have to be careful because this one is really loose in the hilt. This one has no piercing on the shells. And actually, when I mentioned before how these shells are usually some metal sheets that are fixed onto a frame, in this case, this is just one piece. The whole guard is kind of a mono block, you could say. Now, you may think, okay, this is unusual, so perhaps this is a sign of not authenticity, but that is not the case. An exact version of this hilt is actually photographed in Paupe's book Blanke Wapens. So it's a book on, well, the source for Dutch edged weapons. So it exists. And these were these were swords meant, as I mentioned earlier, for troops that were on ships. So maybe the lack of pierced guards helped with, I don't know, corrosion or something. That's only speculation, but it's something I can imagine. Now, I mentioned this one is the more stereotypical Walloon-hilted sword. So this one actually doesn't really differ in any way from what you would imagine in your stereotypical version of a Walloon-hilted sword. So we'll leave that aside for now. And we'll come to the last one. This one is often put in the family of Walloon-hilted swords, but it's maybe the one that fits the least. In the sense that while it has many common characteristics, you'll probably see that the defining characteristic here is that it only has one knuckle guard. I mean, of course it has one knuckle guard, but it basically has only one bow. It doesn't have that side protection on the outside of the hand. It doesn't have that extra loop next to the thumb ring, and it doesn't have the connecting bars. However, it does fit in the Walloon-hilted sword style because of the shell guard that, as you can see, is kind of the same style as what we've seen so far, with the exception that perhaps this is a little less asymmetrical. So if we actually look at them, if I pick them up like this, hopefully it's something I can do. There we go, yeah. You'll see that these three on the left kind of match a little more. They have more of a asymmetrical and even smaller shells, whereas this one is almost more heart-shaped and it's not exactly symmetrical. They're different, but it's a different style of guard, I would say. Now, moving on to the blades, because that is also something I want to quickly address. I will be making videos, by the way, of each one of these swords because it will be nice to dive into like the dates and the historical context and use, and I don't have time to do it now, so don't worry if you feel some information is missing, it will be coming. So we'll check this blade first of all. This one has a rather typical profile for a 17th century blade, albeit it is shorter than what you would expect, but it has basically a rather pronounced diamond shape with this strong ridge in the center that runs right the way up to the tip. It's, in terms of flexibility, it's really not that flexible at all. This is a sword that doesn't bend much. I mean, of course, if you apply much pressure to it, it will bend. This feels like it could pierce someone or something very easily, and slash too. It was sharp on both sides, so you can feel an edge on both sides. And this middle ridge here stays quite prevalent up to the tip. It's not just like a decorative element, I would say. It's actually giving strength and structure to the whole blade up to the tip. Now, if we look at the VOC one, we'll notice some difference. It's a similar profile in the sense that we have, again, a symmetrical blade that runs up to the tip, similar spear tip, and two edges. What we have here, though, and this is something that we'll commonly see in many of these Walloon-hilted swords, is this very faint and short fuller that starts kind of here, just at the, after a few centimeters up from the from where the hilt ends, and is just almost barely dug, let's say, as a fuller. So you'll see it's just almost a flattening more than a fuller. And it runs just up to the first fifth, I would say. Lots of times you have inscriptions here. And in this case you do, for example, you have a date. And other than that, this one is quite a bit more flexible. So this is rather more flat as a blade compared to the one we saw before. It's more of a lenticular section, so it doesn't have that central ridge at all, although it does bulge in the center a little. But this one is way, way more flexible, and as we saw before, also considerably lighter. Also, one thing I didn't mention before about this one is that it's the only one that lacks a thumb ring. Again, this is consistent with the versions that are in the Scheepvaart Museum in Amsterdam and in the Ex-Leger Museum, which is the kind of army, Dutch National Army Museum. You'll see that the other three all have thumb rings, although in different sizes and styles. But moving to this third one, we see again, the blade is quite similar, and this perhaps is not surprising. A lot of these Walloon-hilted swords have this exact configuration of blade. So yeah, rather broad, double-edged, rather symmetrical. You do find some versions which are curved too. There are some saber versions of these, especially some that I think are Swiss. So they have this kind of hilt, but the typical dog's head pommel. But let's say the saber version of these is, I think, more of an outlier. Most of the ones you'll see have this style of blade. This one is basically a scaled up version of the second one we saw. You'll see the fuller here is more pronounced, and it starts at the start here. So it's different, but very similar. You'll see it's a short fuller that runs up to a little over the first fifth of the blade. It has, sorry about that, it has the same lenticular profile as the second blade we saw there. So no central ridge. And it's basically a scaled up version of this one. So again, we run into a spear tip here. And when it comes to the last one, maybe not a surprise again, because these blades are all kind of similar. You will see the same style of short fuller. Again, in this one, it's way more marked. And it's also perhaps because whereas on this sword, you probably don't want to remove too much material because the blade is already in itself rather light and delicate. Here, removing a little bit of weight was not going to harm the blade in any way, and if anything, make it lighter. But we see the same style. There's a Passau wolf there. But we see the same lenticular section, and this one runs again all the way into a spear tip that in this case is way more pronounced, though. We've seen the other two are almost a little more rounded. This is a tip that can still poke, let's say, if you're not careful. So overall, in terms of blades, we kind of see a pattern in the sense that most of these match the typical, what you would expect from a Walloon-hilted stereotypical sword, except for the small one that has this heavy center ridge. So today I just wanted to focus on Walloon-hilted swords and kind of give you an overview of how kind of vast and complex the world of Walloon-hilted swords is, and why giving definitions that are perhaps too tight can be a little bit of an issue, because, well, as we can see here, the world is a little more complex than we may think in a simplified version. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any thoughts about any of these swords, if you have any specific insights about why these differences may exist, or if you own any similar ones and want to kind of share your opinions and thoughts and measurements, perhaps, the comments are always open, of course. So for now, that's it, and I'll see you soon in another sword video. Bye!